You know, there's no question about it that the workbench is the most important appliance in the shop. Regardless of the types of things that you build or the tools that you use to build them, if you're going to work with wood, you've got to have a workbench. So the next couple episodes are going to be a series on building a new workbench for my shop based on a couple of historical designs. But just like any other project, before we jump in and start building, we've got to have a plan. It's time to make a couple of decisions. You know, if you're in the market for a new bench, you've got several choices, but you've got to make some decisions. First, are you going to build or are you going to buy? And there really are benefits to both. Buying allows you instant gratification. I mean, in the time that it takes to go to the store or for the UPS truck to deliver the bench, you've got yourself a fully functional bench. Buying also requires very few tools except for, you know, what it takes to put the bench together once you have it. And if you're mostly a power tool user, commercial benches have already pretty much been optimized to the height and the operations that you're going to need that bench for. So they're probably a very good option for you. On the downside, commercial benches tend to be very expensive for a good size heavy bench. I mean, if you're looking at commercial benches heavy enough to do serious work on, really you'll be budgeting anywhere from $1,000 to $3,000 for a bench, and that's a pretty significant chunk of change. If you're looking to do a lot of hand tool work, commercial benches may not be a great option for you. You know, while they're great for the power tool guys, you know, for us hand tool folks, you really want a bench that's custom built to your height, the style of work, and the tools that you use. So you're going to want to customize that bench height, and commercial benches really are, for the most part, a standard height. So there's not a lot of options there. And third, the designs are sort of limited. There aren't too many commercial design options out there with regard to workbenches. So, you know, the typical Scandinavian European style is more or less what you're going to get in a commercial bench. Now, if you choose to build, you've got a lot of options. The design choices are just about limitless. You can pretty much build a bench to fit just about any budget depending on the size and the materials that you choose. And because you're building it, you can pretty much fit it into any space and any budget. On the downside, building is going to require some time investment from you. Doesn't necessarily have to be months and years of investment, but it is still going to require some investment of time. And in addition, it's also going to require some investment in tools. And again, it doesn't have to be a huge investment in tools, but you're not going to get away with a set of ratchets and a screwdriver like you might for a commercial bench. You're going to have a few more tools in order to build your bench. And the next thing you're going to have to make a decision on is the material for your bench if you're going to build it. If you're going to buy, you don't really have a whole lot of choices. Most commercial benches are hardwood, either beech or maple or something along those lines. But if you're going to build, you've got plenty of choices. And really there are three main types of materials that you have available to you to build a workbench. Hardwood, softwood, or engineered materials. Now, hardwood is a good choice because it's heavy, which is really something that you want in a bench, especially if you're going to do a lot of work with hand tools. It's also typically relatively stiff. Again, another good thing because it means the bench is going to remain flat under heavy use. And it's fairly stable. On the other hand, hardwood can be relatively expensive. 2, 3, 4 times as expensive as softwood or engineered materials. Also, a problem that I have personally with hardwood is that it's hard. Most hardwood benches are typically made out of something like birch or maple or beech, and these are fairly hard, dense woods. What that means for someone like me who uses a lot of cherry or walnut or mahogany, which are woods that are softer than my bench wood, is that after I spend a whole bunch of time carving a ball and claw foot or making a tabletop and accidentally drop or bang that tabletop into my bench, well, that piece of furniture, that furniture part, is going to get damaged before my bench does. And that's really not something desirable I want the bench to take a hit before that expensive mahogany or walnut takes a hit. So that's one reason I really don't like working on the hardwood bench that I've had for all these years. Another reason is that hardwood tends to be kind of slippery. This is planed and oiled, and it's a little slick. A softwood bench, on the other hand, tends to have a little bit more grip to it. I don't know if it's because softwoods typically have a little bit more, resin or pitch in the wood, but they tend to be a little grippier, which means you have to use less clamping force to hold things to the bench top, and stuff doesn't tend to slide around on them as easily as they do on a hardwood bench. Engineered materials, again, another choice. Another option, they're flat, which is a great thing. They're typically fairly inexpensive. Again, that's another good benefit. But they tend to be sort of flimsy. They don't really have a lot of stiffness to them. So in order to keep an engineered bench top flat, you really need a good supporting structure underneath, like a torsion box. And engineered materials tend to be a little hard on hand tool edges. So you may find yourself sharpening your saws and your edge tools a little bit more often if you tend to ding them into the bench top. For my new bench, I chose to go with softwood. Specifically, I'm using construction grade lumber. And this is a great choice because it's cost efficient. I think I paid about $100 for all the lumber I'll need for the whole bench. Most home centers carry a good supply of it. And if you buy good wide long boards, I ended up with two 2x12 by 16 footers, one 2x12 by 12 footer, a couple of 1x12s for a shelf underneath, and some 4x4s for the leg stock. You can pick through and find the clearest and flattest boards that you can. I got lucky and found some pretty flat boards, but it does take a little bit of work. I had to go to probably 5 or 6 different home centers before I was able to get lumber that, in my opinion, was satisfactory enough for me to build this bench from. And typically what I'm looking for are wide boards and flat boards. I want the flattest boards that I can find, and I want the clearest and cleanest boards that I can find. So, if I've got to deal with a knot like this, I want to make sure that I can cut around it and cut that out. I don't want to deal with boards that are going to have a lot of knots that I'm going to have to leave in. And if I'm going to have to leave knots in, I want little tiny pin knots that are easy to work with. So you may have to do some shopping around, but most home centers, you can go ahead and pick through the lumber piles as long as you stack them back up neat. They don't typically bother you, so it's a good option. I think another good option would be poplar. It's relatively inexpensive, softer than most of your furniture woods, and relatively easy to work with. So if you don't want to go with construction grade lumber, poplar would be another good choice. Technically a hardwood, but I think it has more properties of a softwood that would make it a real good candidate for a bench. So once you've decided whether to build or buy and what materials you want your bench to be, the last thing you need to decide is on your design. And there are several factors really that are going to play into the best design for you. And no one design is going to be perfect for everyone. And really, there is no such thing as a perfect bench. Every bench is a compromise for different operations. The challenge is to limit the number of compromises that you make. And the design of the bench should really be based on how you're going to use that bench. How do your working style, how do you work? Are you primarily a hand tool user? Do you use a lot of power tools? Do you need to use the bench as an assembly table in addition to a work surface? Does it need to serve as an outfeed table for a table saw or a joiner? All these different things are going to play into how you ultimately design your own bench. Like I said, no one bench is going to be perfect for every person in every shop. A really great way that I think to look at bench design and to help you along is what businesses commonly refer to as an 80-20 rule. And I think it works really good for workbench design. In essence, you get yourself a sheet of paper and make 2 columns in that sheet of paper. Label one column 80%, label the other column 20%. what you're going to do is fill in all the different operations that you might see yourself doing on that bench. And I'm not talking about making furniture or making tools. Really get specific, get detailed, break down the individual steps of making that furniture. Sawing dovetails, cutting tenons, chopping mortises, planing edges, planing faces, routing moldings. Whatever you're going to use that bench for, get very specific about the different things that you intend to use the bench for. And be honest with yourself and make it specific to your tasks, not things that you think you might want to do, but things that you honestly, truly see yourself doing. And divide those tasks up into the 2 columns. In the 20% column, you're going to put all the operations and tasks and things that you're going to use that bench for 20% of the time or less. They go in the 20% column. The operations and tasks that you see yourself using the bench for more than 20% of the time, put them in the 80% column. And be honest. If you someday want to hand plane your moldings, but you only really see yourself doing that once in a while, and you're going to do your moldings on a router table or a shaper the rest of the time, put hand planing moldings in the 20% column. Don't put it in the 80% column. Be honest with yourself and really sit down and think about how you're going to use that bench, and again, how you are going to use that bench. And make this list and separate things into your 80% and your 20% categories. Then what you're going to do when you build your bench, when you design your bench, is to design it to handle the tasks in that 80% column. You want to optimize the bench to handle those tasks. The 20% tasks, they're a minority. We're going to treat them as one-offs or special cases. When the need arises that we need to use the bench for that, we can build an appliance or a special jig in order to do it. We really want to focus on the tasks in that 80% column and design the bench, make it optimized to handle those tasks efficiently. Once you have those tasks set out, then think about how you would do those tasks on the bench. If you're a hand tool guy like me, think about how you're going to secure your stock for face planing. Think about how you're going to secure your stock for edge planing. How are you going to secure it for cutting tenons, sawing dovetails, chopping mortises, using joinery planes or molding planes, sticking moldings. Do you need to use it for assembly? Think about all these different things, different work holding options, vices, holdfasts, different types of clamping setups. And really focus on designing your bench so that it fits your needs, the type of work that you're going to do 80% of the time. Another really important consideration to take into account when you're designing your bench is what tools do you have available to you to build the bench. If you're going to be building your bench with mostly hand tools, you really may want to think about whether or not you want to build a laminated bench top like you see so often. I've built 2 of those style bench tops before, one completely by hand and one using with the help of some machines. And I'll tell you, it's really not a task that I want to do again, especially completely by hand. It's a lot of work, and it's a lot of unnecessary work, really, in my opinion. In my personal opinion, if you're going to build the bench entirely by hand, I really think the best way to do it is to see either one, if you want a thick bench top, something like I have now, or the popular Roubeau style. Really seek out some thick, wide timbers. See if you can get your hands on some 12-quarter or 16-quarter, 12-inch wide stock, and make your bench top out of those 2 big, thick boards. Or think about something more along the lines of the design that I'm going to be building. The top doesn't have to be so thick. It's only going to be about 1.5 inches thick, because there's going to be a support system underneath that top, similar to floor joists. So while the top isn't very thick, it'll still be very well supported and stay plenty flat over the long run. But my top is going to be made out of 2 12-inch wide boards. Again, think about how you're going to build that bench. If you've got the help of a joiner and planer and lots of clamps and table saw, you may decide a different design is easier for you to build with those types of tools. With hand tools, design your bench around the tools that you have available to you to build it. Make it easy for you to build. You don't want to have to spend years building this thing. Now, if you do plan to build your bench, one of the questions you're inevitably going to have to answer is regarding the right height of the bench that you're going to build. And there are a lot of different variations of rules out there about bench height, but they all basically come down to, planing for the most part. You may have heard, to put your hands at your sides and make the top of your bench the height of the knuckle on your pinky or your wrist, or put your palm out and make the top of your bench where your palm ends up. These all will end up with a bench, about an inch or so within each other. So, but keep in mind, again, the types of things that you're going to be using that bench for. If you're mostly a power tool user, you may find that using one of those rules is going to give you a bench that's much too low for what you're going to need. Most of the height rules that you hear are all based on hand planing. Comfortable height and good height for hand planing. But again, height is a compromise. Really, for joinery, a little bit higher is better. For planing, a little bit lower is better. So really ask yourself what you're going to use that bench for most of the time. If you're primarily a power tool user, you may want a slightly higher bench, especially if you're going to need to use it as an assembly table or an outfeed table. Even if you're a hand tool user, mostly, but you're going to use a joiner and planer to do all your your prep of your rough surface boards. You probably don't need a bench that low. Again, those low benches are really designed for hand planing, efficient hand planing. So if your only hand planing is going to consist of smoothing, you may want a higher bench. If most of your hand work is going to be joinery work, you would probably be more comfortable with a bench that's slightly higher. On the other hand, someone like myself, I do a lot of hand planing. I buy my stock rough sawn and I hand plane all of my stock. So I want a lower bench. What I found over the years is that my current bench is much too high for me. It was borderline too high when I used to use metal planes. And that's another thing really that you want to ask yourself. What types of planes do you use? Do you use metal planes? Do you use wooden planes? Consider using a metal plane. Your hand is for the most part right on top of the sole of that plane, so almost right on the bench surface. Using a wooden plane, on the other hand, your hand is about 3 inches off the surface of that bench, so that really can impact the height of your bench as well. If you're going to be doing a lot of hand planing using metal planes, you may want a bench to be a little bit higher. If you're going to be using wooden planes, you may want the bench to be a little bit lower so that you can get over top of the plane. So, how much hand planing are you going to do? What types of planes are you typically going to use? Are you going to do a lot of hand planing, or is your bench mostly going to be used for hand cutting, joinery, and assembly? All these things are going to play into the height of your bench. And of course, how tall you are, and how comfortable you are with a low bench or a high bench. The best recommendation that I can make is to make your bench a little bit higher than you think you might want it. And don't make your bench with trestle feet like I currently have. And what I mean by trestle feet is a foot that goes across the bottom and the legs come down into the foot. If you make your bench a little bit taller than you think you might need, and you just use 4 legs and the legs rest on the floors, use the bench for a couple of months. If it feels a little bit too high for you, you can flip it over and trim the bottoms of those legs and lower that bench a ½ inch, an inch, 2 inches, whatever you need. Lower it a little bit at a time until it feels right. In a bench with trestle feet, you don't have that option. You really can't. It's very difficult to make them lower. And you want to make it a little bit higher than you think you'll need, because obviously it's easier to cut wood off and make the bench shorter than it is to make the bench taller. So really think about what you're going to use the bench for, the different types of operations, and the different types of tools you're going to use. to be able to plan the appropriate height and size bench for you. One last point that you're going to want to keep in mind is your current work area. You may or may not already have a workbench to work with. I do already have one, but I don't plan to use it to build my new workbench. Not because I'm crazy or sadistic or anything like that, maybe a little bit, but really I want to be able to show how we can build this bench without already having a bench to work on, because that can sometimes be a major point of contention. How do you go about building this huge piece of furniture basically without already having a workbench to work on? And it can be done. And I'm going to demonstrate some work holding techniques and different ways of holding your stock while you're working it that don't require the use of the workbench. Of course, if you have a workbench already, using it would be much easier. But if you don't have a workbench, rest assured you can still build one. So I hope you got some ideas for thinking about designing your own bench. Next time we'll get started actually building the new bench. And we'll start by just taking a look at how we can approach building such a big piece without a workbench, some different ways of work holding and some different ways of managing these big boards without having a workbench already. So we're going to get started building the base next time.